The late afternoon sun bled orange across the Montana plains, turning the sparse grass into something that looked almost golden if you squinted hard enough and lied to yourself about what this land really was. Caleb Turner didn't squint, didn't lie. He saw the territory for exactly what it offered: isolation, silence, and enough space that a man could go weeks without hearing another human voice if he planned it right. He'd planned it right. 3 weeks driving 200 head of cattle to the railhead in Billings, sleeping on ground so hard it made his war cot feel like a featherbed, eating beans that tasted like the tin they came in. 3 weeks of dust in his throat and sun that baked the back of his neck raw. 3 weeks of exactly the kind of misery that made sense to a man like him. The cattle were sold. The money was tucked in his saddlebag. Not much, never much, but enough to get through winter if he was careful. And Caleb Turner was always careful. His homestead came into view as he crested the ridge, and that's when everything that made sense stopped making sense. Smoke, thin and gray, rising from his chimney like an accusation. Caleb's hand went to the rifle scabbard before his brain fully processed what he was seeing. The gelding beneath him sensed the shift in his body and started to sidestep, but Caleb held him steady with his knees, eyes locked on that impossible curl of smoke. Nobody came out here. Nobody had reason to. His nearest neighbor was 8 miles south, and they'd established an understanding years ago that worked for both of them: mutual indifference with a side of calculated neglect. The town of Crimson Flats sat 12 miles east, close enough for supplies, far enough that he didn't have to participate in the slow-motion disaster of community. The smoke meant someone had broken that distance. Someone was in his house. Caleb dismounted 100 yards out, moved through the approach the way he'd moved through Virginia timber in '64, low, quiet, using the terrain. The rifle felt familiar in his hands, weight distributed the way it had been for 4 years of his life, when weight distribution meant the difference between breathing and bleeding out in mud. The corral was empty, except for his 2 horses, both looking fat and unbothered. No strange mounts. Whoever was inside had walked, or their horse was in his barn, which meant either desperation or audacity. Both tended to end the same way out here. He came up on the house from the blind side, the side without windows, pressed his back against the rough timber he'd cut and hauled himself. Through the wall, he could hear something that made his finger hesitate on the trigger. Humming. Someone was humming in his kitchen. Not frantic, not scared, just humming. Some tune he half recognized from before the war, before everything became divided into the parts that made sense and the parts that required whiskey to forget. Caleb moved to the window, angled his head just enough to see inside. The woman stood at his stove, wearing a dress the color of creek stone, her dark hair pinned up in a way that suggested she gave a damn about appearances even when breaking into a stranger's home. She was turning something in his cast-iron skillet, and the smell hit him through the gaps in the window frame. Actual food. Not beans, not hardtack, something with onions and herbs and enough complexity that his stomach cramped with want before his brain caught up. She was younger than him by maybe a decade, but carried herself with the kind of certainty that had nothing to do with age. Slender build, but the way she moved suggested strength in the wiry, stubborn places. Her face was angular, sharp at the cheekbones and chin, not soft by any conventional measure, but arresting in a way that made him forget to maintain his tactical position. Then she spoke, without turning around, without any indication she'd seen him. "You planning to shoot me through the window, or are you going to come inside and let me explain why you shouldn't?" Caleb froze. The rifle stayed level, but everything else in him went still in a way that had nothing to do with military training. She turned then, meeting his eyes through the glass, and her expression suggested she'd been waiting for this moment with the patience of someone who knew exactly how it would unfold. "Door's open," she said. "I didn't lock it. Seemed rude considering it's your door." Every instinct Caleb had cultivated since Appomattox told him to handle this the simple way: order her out, watch her go, return to the silence that worked. Instead, he found himself walking to his own front door like a guest. The interior of his cabin was exactly as he'd left it, except for the parts that weren't. His table, the rough-hewn one he'd built from lodgepole pine, had a cloth on it. Not fancy, just clean linen, but it transformed the surface into something that suggested purpose beyond function. 2 plates sat waiting. 2 sets of utensils that he recognized as his own, but had never seen arranged with such deliberate care. She'd cleaned. He could see it in the way the evening light hit surfaces that usually held a film of bachelor dust. The floor had been swept. His books, the 7 he owned, had been straightened on their shelf. "You're upset," she said, still at the stove. "That's reasonable. Man comes home to find a stranger in his house. He's got a right to some feelings about it. I've got a right to more than feelings." His voice came out rougher than intended, scraped raw from 3 weeks of not using it for anything beyond commands to cattle and his horse. "You do," she agreed. "You could throw me out. Probably should, by most standards of social convention and property rights." She lifted the skillet off the heat, tilted it so he could see the contents. "But then you'd miss out on the first proper meal you've had in weeks. And I'd miss out on the conversation I came here to have." "We don't have a conversation to have. I don't know you." "Elara Quinn." She said it like an answer to a question he hadn't asked. School teacher, widow, owner of uncomfortably strong opinions about how men in this territory treat basic hospitality. Caleb's grip tightened on the rifle. Not threatening, just steadying. "Mrs. Quinn." "Miss," she interrupted. "The Mrs. died with my husband 3 years back. I kept the courtesy title for a while because it made the school board less nervous, but I've recently decided I'm done with courtesies that don't serve me." She moved past him while he was still holding the rifle, and set the skillet on a trivet in the center of his table. The scent that rose from it made his mouth water against his will. Venison, unless he missed his guess, cooked with onions and what might have been thyme from the wild patches that grew near the creek. "I could have you arrested for breaking and entering." "You could." Elara pulled out one of his chairs and sat down, completely at ease. "Sheriff Dunmore would probably enjoy that. Give him something to do besides manage drunk minors and pretend he doesn't know about the poker games in the back of Brennan's store." She looked up at him, and her eyes were the color of creek water over stones, gray-green and impossible to read at depth. "But you won't, because you're curious now, and curiosity is harder to ignore than anger." She wasn't wrong, which made it worse. Caleb leaned the rifle against the wall, within reach but no longer in hand, and pulled out the other chair. Didn't sit. Just stood there with his hands on the ladder back, trying to figure out what kind of game this was and what the rules might be. "Why are you here, Miss Quinn?" "I heard you were coming back today. The Hendersons' boys saw you on the trail yesterday, heading this direction. Word spreads in a town the size of Crimson Flats, even when people pretend they mind their own business." She gestured to the empty chair. "Sit down, Mr. Turner. I promise the food isn't poisoned, though I understand if you need a minute to consider trust as a concept." He sat, not because she told him to, but because his legs were tired and his body was starting to override his brain's objections. Elara served the food with movements that suggested practice, not the fussy kind that came from trying to impress, but the efficient kind that came from years of making meals matter. She gave him the larger portion without comment, kept the smaller for herself, and poured water from his own pitcher into his own cups. 3 weeks ago, she said, cutting into her portion with his second-best knife, "I made a comment at the general store about how it was a shame that men in this territory seemed to think basic nutrition was optional. Mrs. Henderson, who talks too much but means well, mentioned that you lived out here alone, hardly ever came to town, and probably hadn't had a home-cooked meal since before you left for the cattle drive." Caleb chewed slowly, buying time. The venison was perfect, seasoned right, cooked through but still tender. It made him angry in a way he couldn't quite articulate. "That doesn't explain breaking into my house." "I didn't break anything. Your door wasn't locked. I walked in, cleaned a bit, cooked food I brought myself, and waited." She met his eyes over the table. "I wanted to see what kind of man gets talked about the way you get talked about." "And how do I get talked about?" Carefully. She took a sip of water. "People in town have opinions about you, Mr. Turner. Most of them contradictory. Some say you're dangerous. Some say you're just broken. Mrs. Henderson thinks you're lonely but too proud to admit it. The sheriff thinks you're one bad winter away from doing something everyone will regret. Brennan, who runs the store, says you're the most reliable customer he has because you never argue about prices and always pay in full. Sounds like Brennan's the only one who's got it right." "Maybe." Elara set down her fork, leaned back in her chair. "But here's what I think. I think you're a man who's built a very careful life where nothing unexpected can happen, and I think that's probably killing you slower than a bullet, but just as thoroughly." The anger that spiked through him was clean and familiar. You don't know a damn thing about me. I know you were at Wilderness. I know you made it through 3 years of war and came back missing pieces that don't show in a mirror. Her voice didn't soften, which somehow made it worse. I know you built this place with your own hands, raise horses nobody wants to buy because they're too smart and too stubborn, and that you go weeks without saying more than a dozen words to another human being. Sounds like Mrs. Henderson talks too much about everyone, not just me. Small towns are built on talk. You know that. She leaned forward, elbows on his table, and the directness of her gaze made him want to look away. He didn't. But here's what I don't know. I don't know what it would take for a man like you to let someone pass that wall you've built. I don't know if it's even possible, or if you're too committed to this slow fade into isolation. That's not your concern. It isn't, she agreed, but I made it my concern anyway. Because I'm tired of watching people in this territory treat survival like it's the same thing as living, and I figured if I was going to make a point, I might as well make it where it would cause the most disruption. Caleb set down his fork. The plate was half empty, and he wanted to finish it, but something about this conversation required his full attention. You came out here to disrupt me. I came out here to cook you a meal and have a conversation. If that's disruptive, Mr. Turner, you might want to ask yourself why basic human kindness feels like an invasion. The silence that followed was the kind that had weight. Not uncomfortable exactly, but full of things neither of them was saying. Outside, the sun was dropping toward the horizon, painting the room in shades of amber and copper. Ilara's face in that light looked carved from something harder than the softness her age suggested. There were lines around her eyes. Not many, but enough to suggest she'd done her share of squinting into hard truths. Why teaching? Caleb asked, surprising himself. Out here, I mean. There are easier places to run a school. Because easy isn't the point. She picked up her fork again, took another bite. I came west after my husband died because staying in Pennsylvania meant watching everyone I knew try to patch me up like I was broken crockery. Out here, nobody knows enough about who I was to have expectations about who I should be. But they have expectations anyway. They do, she admitted. Just different ones. Teacher, widow, woman alone. Each of those comes with a set of rules I'm supposed to follow, and I've gotten fairly skilled at knowing which rules matter and which ones I can ignore without causing the kind of scandal that gets me fired. And breaking into a bachelor's home? Where does that fall on your scandal scale? For the first time, she smiled. Not a polite smile. Something with edges. Depends entirely on how you respond. If you throw me out and never speak of this again, it's an eccentricity. If you tell people in town, it becomes a cautionary tale about women with too much education and not enough supervision. She paused. If you invite me back, it becomes something else entirely. Caleb felt something shift in his chest. Not quite alarm. Not quite interest. Something in between that he didn't have a name for. I didn't invite you this time. No, Ilara agreed. But you didn't throw me out either. You sat down. You ate. You asked me questions. That's more than most men in your position would do, which suggests either remarkable tolerance or crippling loneliness. Could be I'm just too tired to argue. Could be. She stood, started gathering the plates with the same efficient grace she'd used to serve them. Or could be you're just as curious about what happens next as I am. Caleb watched her move through his kitchen like she had a right to be there, washing dishes in his basin, drying them with a cloth she must have brought, because he didn't own anything that clean. Every movement was deliberate but unself-conscious, the actions of someone who'd done this work 10,000 times and found a rhythm in it. Why are you really here, Miss Quinn? She paused, hands still in the water. Because I'm 32 years old, and I've spent the last 3 years being exactly what everyone expects me to be. Dutiful, appropriate, invisible when necessary. And I woke up 3 weeks ago realizing that if I didn't do something unexpected, I was going to disappear into that role completely. She turned, met his eyes. So I picked the most unexpected thing I could think of. I picked you. I'm not a project. I know. If you were, this would be easier and considerably less interesting. She dried her hands, folded the cloth with precise corners. I'm not here to fix you, Mr. Turner. I'm here because I wanted to meet the one person in Crimson Flats who seems as uninterested in performing for an audience as I'm tired of being. She collected her shawl from where she'd draped it over his second chair, wrapped it around her shoulders with movements that suggested ritual. At the door, she paused. I'm going to walk back to town now. It's an hour's walk and I have a lantern, so don't trouble yourself with concern about my safety. She looked back at him, silhouetted against the dying light. But I'd like to come back. Next week, maybe. Cook another meal, have another conversation. See if this thing that just happened here is a one-time disruption or the start of something neither of us has the good sense to avoid. Caleb stood and the chair scraped against the floor with a sound that filled the space. And if I say no? Then I'll respect that, and you'll go back to your silence, and I'll go back to being exactly what everyone expects. She smiled again, and it was sadder this time. But I don't think you're going to say no, Mr. Turner. I think you're going to spend the next week trying to convince yourself you should, and then when I show up at your door, you're going to let me in anyway. She was right, and they both knew it, which made the silence that followed less about uncertainty and more about acknowledgement. Tuesday, Caleb said. The word came out before he'd fully decided to say it. If you're coming back, come on Tuesday. I'll be here. Tuesday, Alara agreed. Then she was gone, the door closing behind her with a soft click that sounded nothing like an ending. Caleb stood in his kitchen, cleaner than it had been in months, smelling like herbs and cooked meat and something else he couldn't quite name, and tried to remember the last time another person had been inside these walls. Couldn't. He walked to the window, watched Alara's figure grow smaller against the darkening plain, lantern swinging in rhythm with her steps. She moved like she owned the distance, like the isolation that had driven him to this place was just another landscape to navigate. The plates were clean, the floor was swept, his books were straight on their shelf. Everything was exactly as it should be, except for the ways it wasn't. Caleb touched the tablecloth, just linen, nothing fancy, and felt the texture under his calloused fingers. Someone had brought this into his house. Someone had seen the rough surface underneath and decided it needed covering. He should take it off. Return the table to its functional nakedness. Erase the evidence of this disruption and go back to the careful routine that worked. Instead, he left it. Went outside to tend his horses, who nickered at him with the mild accusation of animals who'd been fed late, but not late enough to hold a real grudge. The gelding from the cattle drive needed his tack stripped and his legs checked. The mare needed fresh hay, simple work, familiar work. But even in the barn, with his hands occupied and his mind supposedly focused, Caleb kept circling back to the same thought. Someone had walked into his carefully constructed isolation and sat down at his table like she had a right to be there. And he'd let her, more than let her. He'd invited her back. The night settled over the plains with the kind of completeness that only happened this far from civilization. No lights except the stars. No sounds except the wind and the small noises of animals settling down. The kind of quiet that used to feel like peace. Now it just felt like waiting. Caleb went back inside, lit his lamp, sat in the chair Alara had used. The perspective was different from this side of the table. He could see the shelf where his books lived, the stove that suddenly looked less functional and more potentially hospitable, the door that no longer seemed quite as effective at keeping the world out. He should regret this, should recognize it for what it was. A crack in the foundation, a weakness that would only grow wider. But when he tried to summon regret, all he got was the memory of her voice saying, "I picked you." Like it was a choice that mattered, like he was something more than the accumulation of silence and distance he'd become. Sleep didn't come easy that night. When it did, it brought dreams that weren't quite nightmares, but weren't quite anything else either. Images of tables set for two, doors opening, distances crossed by people who had no business crossing them. He woke before dawn, same as always, but the routine felt different now. The silence wasn't quite as complete. The isolation wasn't quite as secure. Tuesday was 6 days away. Caleb told himself he'd send her away when she came. Told himself this was a mistake that needed correcting before it became something worse. But he cleaned his house anyway, swept the floor that she'd already swept, straightened things that didn't need straightening. Found himself standing in front of his small mirror, cracked in the corner, spotted with age, and actually looking at what he saw there. 40 years old, though the face looking back could have been older. Sun-weathered skin, lines cut deep around eyes and mouth, hair that needed cutting, beard that needed trimming. The eyes themselves were still clear, still the same gray-blue they'd always been, but something in them had changed since yesterday. They looked less certain, less settled, more alive. He turned away from the mirror before that thought could develop into something he'd have to acknowledge. The week moved forward with the same rhythm it always had. Horses to tend, fence to mend, a dozen small tasks that filled the hours between dawn and dark. But underneath the routine, something had shifted. The silence was no longer neutral. It was anticipatory. Monday night, Caleb found himself cooking his own meal with more care than necessary, seasoning it the way Alara had seasoned the venison, trying to replicate something he couldn't quite name. The result was edible, but not the same, missing something that had nothing to do with ingredients and everything to do with intent. Tuesday dawned clear and cold, the kind of early autumn day that promised winter without quite delivering it yet. Caleb went through his morning routine, worked the horses longer than necessary, checked his fence line twice. When the sun started its descent toward afternoon, he gave up pretending he wasn't waiting, cleaned himself up properly this time, changed into his second shirt, not cleaner, but less worn, ran water through his hair and actually combed it, trimmed his beard just enough to look intentional rather than neglected. Then he sat at his table and waited, feeling like a fool and unable to stop. She arrived exactly when the sun hit the halfway point between noon and dusk, walking up the track with the same confident stride she'd used to leave, carrying a basket that suggested she'd made this trip with purpose and planning. Caleb watched her approach from the window, and something in his chest loosened in a way that felt both dangerous and inevitable. He opened the door before she could knock. "Tuesday," Alara said, like she was confirming a fact they both knew. "Tuesday," Caleb agreed and stepped aside to let her in. The die was cast. The distance was crossed. Whatever came next would be something neither of them had planned for. And both of them were walking toward it anyway, one meal at a time, one conversation at a time, one small surrender at a time. The basket contained bread still warm enough that Caleb could feel the heat through the cloth when Alara set it on his table. Also, butter wrapped in wax paper, a jar of something dark that might have been preserves, and a whole chicken already dressed and ready for roasting. "I figured if I'm going to make a habit of this, I should bring ingredients," she said, unpinning her hat and setting it on the sideboard like she'd done it 100 times before. "Feels less like charity and more like collaboration. Collaboration requires both parties to contribute. You're providing the location and the company. That's contribution enough?" She moved to the stove, checking the firebox with the casual competence of someone who understood how cast iron worked. "Though, if you wanted to help with the preparation, I wouldn't object." Caleb found himself standing in the middle of his own kitchen, uncertain of his role in this script they were writing, without rehearsal. "I can manage vegetables." "Good. There are carrots and potatoes in the basket. Probably need peeling." They worked in a silence that should have been awkward, but somehow wasn't. Caleb peeled potatoes at his counter while Alara seasoned the chicken with herbs she'd brought in a small cloth pouch. The knife in his hand moved with the automatic precision of a man who'd done this task 1,000 times. But his attention kept drifting to the woman moving through his space with such deliberate ease. "You're staring," Alara said without looking up from her work. "I'm trying to figure out what you're actually doing here." "Cooking chicken?" "That's not what I mean, and you know it." She did look up then, meeting his eyes with that same direct gaze that had unsettled him a week ago. "What do you think I'm doing here, Mr. Turner?" "I think you're testing something. I just haven't figured out what, or why it needs to be tested on me." Alara set down the chicken, wiped her hands on her apron. When had she put on an apron? Had she brought it or found one of his old rags and transformed it into something purposeful? "Fair enough. You want the honest answer or the polite one?" "I've never had much use for polite." "Neither have I, which is why I'm here instead of attending the ladies' auxiliary meeting, where I'm supposed to be discussing proper Christian behavior and the moral education of children." She leaned against his counter, arms crossed. "The honest answer is that I spent 3 years being the perfect widow. Quiet, grateful, appropriately sad, but not so sad that I made people uncomfortable. And somewhere in the middle of that performance, I realized I'd stopped being a person and become a role. So I decided to stop. And that decision led you to my door. It led me to think about what I actually wanted instead of what was expected. Turns out what I wanted was to sit across from someone who didn't need me to be anything other than present." She tilted her head, studying him. "You don't perform, Mr. Turner. You don't pretend. That's rare enough to be valuable." Caleb went back to peeling potatoes, processing this information in the slow, methodical way he processed most things that mattered. "You're assuming I'm not performing right now." "Are you?" He considered lying, found he didn't have the energy for it. "No." See? Valuable. She returned to the chicken, sliding it into the roasting pan with movements that suggested she'd done this enough times to make it muscle memory. Now tell me something true, something you haven't told anyone else. That's a dangerous game. Only if you're afraid of being known. The potato in his hand was perfectly peeled, white flesh revealed in a continuous ribbon of skin. Caleb set it aside, reached for another. I don't dream about the war anymore. Haven't for years. But I dream about silence. Being in a room so quiet I can hear my own heartbeat, and then having that silence broken by something I can't control. Wake up every time, right when the sound comes. Elara was quiet for long enough that he thought maybe he'd miscalculated, shared too much too soon. Then, I dream about my husband's funeral. Not the sad parts, those I can handle. I dream about standing next to the grave and realizing I felt relief more than grief. That I was free and didn't have to pretend to be sad about it. Wake up feeling guilty every single time. Caleb looked at her then, really looked, and saw something in her face that matched the jagged edges in his own chest. Not the same wounds, but the same understanding that some wounds don't show and don't heal and don't need to be explained to people who carry their own. Your husband, he said carefully. You didn't love him. I married him because it was expected and he was kind, and I was 19 and stupid about what constitutes a good reason to bind your life to another person's. She slid the pan into the oven, adjusted the heat with practiced efficiency. He was a good man, just not the right man. And by the time I figured that out, he was dying of consumption, and I had to play the devoted wife while secretly counting the days until I could stop pretending. That's honest. You asked for true. True isn't always pretty. She wiped her hands again, moved to the basin to wash the seasoning off her fingers. Your turn again. What brought you out here, to this specific piece of nowhere? It was far enough from Virginia that nobody would ask questions about the war. Close enough to town that I could get supplies. Had water and enough grass for horses. He quartered the potatoes with quick, efficient cuts. And it was the kind of place where a man could go weeks without having to talk to anyone if he didn't want to. Except now you're talking to me. Except now I'm talking to you, he agreed, though I'm still not entirely sure how that happened. I'm persistent, and you were curious. Dangerous combination. She dried her hands, turned to face him fully. But here's what I'm wondering, Mr. Turner. How long are we going to keep calling each other by our surnames like we're acquaintances at a church social? The question landed with more weight than it should have. Names were just words, but they were also boundaries. And Elara Quinn had a habit of identifying boundaries right before she walked through them. Caleb, he said, felt strange saying it to someone who wasn't his horse or the wind. My name is Caleb. Elara. She smiled, and it was the real thing this time, not the careful social version. There. Now we're people instead of titles. The chicken needed an hour to roast, which meant an hour of time to fill. Elara settled into the chair she'd claimed the week before, and Caleb took the other one. And they sat across his table like it was the most natural thing in the world instead of something that violated every rule he'd built his life around. Tell me about the horses, Elara said. So he did. Told her about the breeding program he'd started 5 years back, trying to produce animals with the intelligence of wild mustangs and the temperament for ranch work. How most buyers wanted dumb and biddable, and his horses were too smart for their own good, which meant he usually ended up keeping them longer than was financially sensible. You anthropomorphize them, Elara observed. I respect them. There's a difference. Is there? You just said that gelding out there has opinions about weather patterns. He does. Gets agitated 12 hours before a storm. More reliable than any barometer. Elara laughed, and the sound filled his kitchen in a way that made the space feel smaller and larger simultaneously. All right, I'll grant you that one. What else do they have opinions about? Your visits, apparently. Mare's been watching the road more than usual, knows something's changed. Smart mare. Elara's expression shifted into something more serious. Does it bother you, having someone here? Caleb considered the question with the weight it deserved. It should. Probably would have even a month ago, but no. It doesn't bother me. It unsettles me, which is different. How so? Bothered is when something's wrong and needs fixing. Unsettled is when something's changing and you don't know yet if that change is disaster or something else. And which do you think this is? He met her eyes across the table. Ask me again in a month. They talked through the cooking time, and the conversation moved like water finding channels, sometimes deep, sometimes shallow, always in motion. Alara told him about the school, about teaching children whose parents couldn't always see the value in education, but sent them anyway because it was what you did in towns that wanted to believe they were civilized. Caleb told her about the winter 2 years back when the snow got so deep he'd lived on what he'd stored and hadn't seen another person for 11 weeks straight. "Didn't you go crazy?" Alara asked. "No, that's the thing people don't understand. Silence isn't the thing that makes you crazy. It's the noise pretending to be connection that does that. Now, who's being philosophical? I've had a lot of time to think." Dangerous habit, thinking. But she said it with warmth, not judgment. The chicken came out perfect, golden skin crackling in a way that made Caleb's mouth water. Alara carved it with the same competent efficiency she brought to everything, and they ate in a companionable quiet that felt earned rather than awkward. "This is good," Caleb said, and meant it in ways that extended beyond the food. "It is," Alara agreed. "Strange, but good." They were washing dishes together. When had that become a joint activity instead of something she did while he watched? When Alara spoke again. "The town is going to notice eventually, if they haven't already." Caleb's hands stilled in the wash water. "Notice what?" "That I'm coming out here. That we're—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Whatever this is we're doing. Does that concern you?" "It concerns me less than it probably should." She dried a plate with careful attention to the edges. "I'm a school teacher, Caleb. A widow. There are expectations about how I conduct myself, and spending time alone with a bachelor rancher isn't on the approved list of activities." "We could stop." "We could." She set the plate down, picked up another. "But I don't want to, and I don't think you do either." She was right, which was its own kind of problem. "What do you want then?" Alara turned to look at him, and in the lamplight her face was all angles and shadows, and something fierce he was only beginning to recognize. "I want to keep doing this. Coming here, cooking meals, talking about things that matter and things that don't. I want to see what happens when two people decide that connection is more important than propriety. That's a risk. Living is a risk. I spent 3 years playing it safe, and all it got me was the certainty that safe is just another word for slow death." She dried her hands, untied the apron. "But I need to know you understand what you're agreeing to. If people start talking, and they will start talking, it won't be gentle gossip. It'll be the kind that has consequences." Caleb dried his own hands, leaned back against the counter. "I've never given much thought to what people in town think of me." "That's because you've never given them anything interesting to think about. This would be different." "Would it change things for you? At the school?" "Possibly. The school board is made up of men who have very specific ideas about appropriate female behavior. A widow spending unchaperoned time with a man." She shrugged. "They might decide I'm not a suitable moral influence on children. That's horseshit. That's reality." But she smiled when she said it, "Though I appreciate your indignation on my behalf." They stood there in his kitchen, the dishes done and the evening settling in around them, and Caleb felt the weight of a decision forming. Not the kind you made with your head, because logic would say this was a bad idea in about 17 different ways. The kind you made with something deeper, and the part of you that understood that some risks were worth taking even when you couldn't calculate the odds. "Come back next week," he said. "You sure?" "No, but I want you to come back anyway." Alara nodded, slow and serious. "All right. But Caleb, if this gets complicated, when it gets complicated, I need you to be honest with me. Don't try to protect me from consequences I'm choosing to risk. Same goes for you. Deal." She left as the last light was fading, and Caleb stood in his doorway, watching her walk toward town with her lantern swinging and her stride never faltering. When he could no longer see her light, he went back inside to a kitchen that smelled like roasted chicken and bread and the subtle scent of whatever herbs she'd used to season everything. The tablecloth was still there. He hadn't taken it off after her first visit, and now it had the permanent quality of something that belonged. The following week, she came on Tuesday as promised, and the week after that, and the one after that until Tuesday became the day Caleb cleaned his house and trimmed his beard and found himself watching the road hours before she was due to arrive. They fell into a rhythm that felt both strange and inevitable. Alara would arrive in the afternoon, they'd cook together. Actually together now, not her doing the work while he watched. And then they'd eat and talk until the light died and she had to leave to make it back to town before full dark. The conversations deepened. She told him about her childhood in Pennsylvania, about a father who drank and a mother who compensated by being rigidly proper, about escaping to teaching because it was the only respectable way for a woman to leave home without a husband. He told her about growing up in Virginia, about a family that didn't survive the war, not dead, just scattered and broken in ways that made regathering impossible. On the fifth Tuesday, it rained. Not the gentle kind that whispered against the roof, but the violent autumn kind that came with wind and thunder and the promise of early winter. Alara arrived soaked despite her oilskin coat, her hair plastered to her head and her skirts heavy with water. "I should turn around," she said from his doorway, dripping onto the floorboards. "This isn't letting up any time soon." Caleb looked past her at the storm turning the plains into a gray wall of water, looked back at her, shivering and stubborn, and clearly having walked an hour through weather that would have sent most people home. "You're not walking back in this." "I can't stay here, Caleb. Not overnight. I know what it is." He stepped back, holding the door wider. "But I'm not sending you back out in a storm that's going to get worse before it gets better. Come inside. We'll figure it out." She hesitated on the threshold, and he could see the calculation happening behind her eyes, the weighing of risks, the counting of costs, the decision that would change everything or nothing depending on what came next. Then she stepped inside, and Caleb closed the door on the storm and whatever judgment might come with it. He found her dry clothes, his own shirt, and an old pair of work pants that she had to roll at the ankles. She changed behind the screen he used for bathing, emerged looking younger somehow in the too large clothing, her hair drying in waves around her face. "I look ridiculous," she said. "You look warm. That's what matters." They hung her wet things by the stove to dry, and Caleb built up the fire while Alara made coffee with the grounds she'd brought weeks ago, and that he now kept stocked because she preferred it to tea. The storm raged outside, turning afternoon into premature twilight. Rain hammered the roof with a sound like distant cavalry. Wind tested the corners of the house, finding the weak spots and exploiting them with cold fingers that made the lamp flame dance. "I've never seen it come up this fast," Alara said, curled in the chair with her hands wrapped around the coffee mug. "Early winter storms are like that. They build over the mountains, drop fast." Caleb sat across from her, his own mug warming his palms. "Should have known from how the mare was acting this morning. She tried to tell me. Your weather-predicting horse. She's earned her feed." Alara smiled, but it was distracted, her mind clearly working through the implications of being trapped here. "They're going to notice in town that I didn't come back. Mrs. Henderson? Among others, the school board will hear about it by morning, assuming the storm doesn't keep everyone home. What will they do?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee like it might have answers. "Best case? They'll call me in, express concern for my reputation, suggest I be more careful about appearances. Worst case? They'll decide I'm not fit to teach their children and terminate my contract. For getting caught in a storm, for making choices that put me in a position where getting caught in a storm meant spending the night with a man." She looked up, met his eyes. "It's not about what actually happened, Caleb. It's about what it looks like, what people will assume, what story they'll tell themselves." "And what story will they tell themselves? That I'm a fallen woman, that you took advantage, that we're—" She paused, and something shifted in her expression. "That we're lovers." The word hung in the air between them, heavy, with implications they hadn't spoken aloud yet but had been circling for weeks. "Are we?" Caleb asked quietly. Alara set down her coffee mug with careful precision. "I don't know what we are. I just know that I look forward to Tuesdays more than any other day, that I think about you when I'm teaching, when I'm lying in bed at night, when I'm listening to Mrs. Henderson talk about proper Christian living." She leaned forward, elbows on her knees. "I know that being here feels more real than anything I do the rest of the week. Does that make us lovers? I don't know, but it makes us something." Caleb felt his pulse in his throat, his chest, his fingertips wrapped around the mug. "If they fire you, then I'll figure something else out. I always do." But there was tightness around her eyes that suggested it wasn't as simple as she was making it sound. "You could leave. Go to another town. Teach there." "I could, but I don't want to." She stood, moved to the window, looked out at the rain-blurred world. I'm tired of running from things, Caleb. Tired of making myself smaller to fit into spaces that were never designed for me anyway. If staying here means facing consequences, then I'll face them. He stood too, moved to stand beside her at the window. Their reflections looked back at them from the dark glass. Two people who'd somehow ended up in the same unlikely place, making the same unlikely choices. I don't want you to lose your job because of me. It wouldn't be because of you. It would be because I chose this. I'm choosing this. She turned to face him, and they were close enough now that he could see the flecks of green in her gray eyes, the faint freckles the sun had left across her nose. The question is whether you're choosing it too. Caleb had spent years avoiding exactly this kind of moment, the kind where you had to decide if connection was worth the cost, if letting someone in was worth the risk of losing them, if breaking isolation was worth the vulnerability it required. But standing there with Alara looking at him like he was something more than the sum of his silences and scars, he found the decision was already made. Had probably been made the moment he'd let her in the first time instead of ordering her out. "I'm choosing it," he said. Alara's expression softened into something that might have been relief or fear or both. "Good. Because I think we're past the point where we could walk away even if we wanted to." The storm didn't let up. If anything, it intensified as night came on, wind shrieking around the corners of the house and rain turning the world outside into nothing but sound and fury. Caleb gave Alara his bed, the only one in the single-room cabin, and made himself a pallet on the floor near the stove. "This is ridiculous," Alara said from the bed. "I'm not taking your bed while you sleep on the floor. You're a guest. I'm a woman in your house overnight, wearing your clothes, about to sleep in your bed. I think we're past the point where guest protocols apply." Despite everything, Caleb smiled. "Probably. But you're sleeping in the bed anyway." He lay on his pallet, listening to her breathe, to the storm outside, to the small sounds of a house that held two people instead of one. It should have been impossible to sleep with all that newness, all that change. But when sleep came, it came without the dream of silence breaking. Instead, he dreamed of tables set for two, of doors opening, of distances crossed by people brave enough to walk them. When morning came, the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and strange. Alara dressed in her own clothes, mostly dry now, and prepared to face whatever waited in town. At the door she paused. "This changes things." "I know. People will talk. The school board will hear. There will be consequences." "I know," Caleb said again. "Are you afraid?" She considered the question seriously. "Yes, but not enough to wish it hadn't happened." "Neither am I." She kissed him then, quick and soft and shocking in its simplicity. Just a press of lips that lasted maybe 3 seconds but rearranged everything that came before and after. "Tuesday?" she asked. "Tuesday," he confirmed, and she walked back toward town and whatever judgment waited there, her spine straight and her step steady. And Caleb stood in his doorway watching her go with the certain knowledge that nothing would ever be the same again. The summons came 3 days after the storm, delivered by Sheriff Dunmore himself, who rode out to Caleb's place with the kind of deliberate slowness that suggested he wasn't enjoying his errand. "School board wants to see you," Dunmore said from his saddle, not bothering to dismount. "You and Miss Quinn, tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock, at the church hall." Caleb stood in his doorway, arms crossed. "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that they're the school board, and they want to see you." Dunmore shifted his weight, leather creaking. "Look, Turner, I don't give a damn what you and the school teacher do with your time, but there are people in this town who care a great deal about appearances, and right now the appearance is that a respectable widow spent the night at a bachelor's ranch. During a storm that would have killed her if she'd tried to walk back. I know that, you know that. Hell, even most of them know that. But knowing it and accepting it are two different things." Dunmore finally dismounted, tied his horse to Caleb's rail. "Can I speak plainly? When have you ever done otherwise?" "Fair point." The sheriff pulled off his hat, ran a hand through his thinning hair. "There are men on that school board who've been looking for a reason to get rid of Alara Quinn since the day she told Reverend Morrison that his views on women's education were approximately 200 years out of date. They see this as their opportunity. To fire her for getting caught in weather. To fire her for being unmarried and unchaperoned in a man's home overnight. The weather is irrelevant to their moral calculations." Dunmore's expression hardened. And before you go in there tomorrow planning to defend her reputation, you should know that defending it might be the thing that destroys it. These men don't want logic. They want compliance. Caleb felt something cold settle in his chest. What are you saying? I'm saying that if you care about her keeping her job, the best thing you can do is stay quiet and let her handle it. She's better at navigating their expectations than you'll ever be. And if I don't want to stay quiet? Dunmore put his hat back on, adjusted it with careful precision. Then you better be prepared for the consequences of that choice. For both of you. After the sheriff left, Caleb saddled his gelding and rode to town, something he almost never did outside of necessary supply runs. Crimson Flats looked the same as it always did, a collection of wooden buildings pretending to be civilization, arranged along a single main street with delusions of grandeur. He found Alara at the schoolhouse, cleaning slate boards while 3 children practiced their letters in the corner. She looked up when he entered, and something in her expression told him she'd been expecting this. "Mr. Hendricks, Sarah, Tommy, you're dismissed for the day," she said to the children, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made them gather their things without argument. When they'd filed out, she set down her cloth and turned to face him fully. "You heard. Dunmore came by, said the school board wants to see us tomorrow. They want to see me. You're optional, though I suspect they'll use your presence or absence as additional evidence of character." She moved to her desk, began organizing papers with movements that were slightly too precise, slightly too controlled. "I've been preparing my defense." "Alara, don't." She held up a hand. "Don't tell me it'll be fine, or that we didn't do anything wrong, or that they're being unreasonable. I know all of that already. What I need to know is whether you're going to be there tomorrow." "Of course I'll be there. Even if it makes things worse. Because Dunmore is right, these men are looking for scandal, and having you there defending me might give them exactly what they want." Caleb crossed the empty schoolroom, stopped a few feet from her desk. "What do you want me to do?" She looked at him for a long moment, and he could see the calculation happening behind her eyes, the same weighing of costs and consequences he'd seen on his doorstep during the storm. "I want you to be there. I want them to see that I'm not ashamed and I'm not apologizing. But Caleb, if this goes badly, and there's a good chance it will, I need you to let me handle it. Don't fight my battles for me. Even if they're being, especially then, because the moment you step in, it stops being about my choices and becomes about you protecting me. And I don't need protecting. I need you to trust that I can stand on my own even when the ground is shaking." He understood what she was saying, even if every instinct he had wanted to argue against it. "All right, but I'm still going to be there." "I know." She smiled, tired but genuine. "That's why I'm not more worried than I already am." The church hall at 9 in the morning was exactly as unwelcoming as Caleb had imagined. 5 men sat behind a table that had been positioned to suggest authority. Reverend Morrison in the center, flanked by James Brennan from the general store, Thomas Wright, who owned the largest ranch in the county, Dr. Abernathy, and Harold Chen, who ran the assay office and was the only member of the board who looked actively uncomfortable with the proceedings. Alara sat in a chair facing them, spine straight, hands folded in her lap. Caleb stood against the back wall, arms crossed, saying nothing but making his presence known. Reverend Morrison cleared his throat with the self-importance of a man who believed his moral authority was granted by forces beyond question. "Miss Quinn, thank you for coming. I trust you understand why we've called this meeting. I assume it has to do with the storm 3 nights ago and my decision to take shelter at Mr. Turner's ranch rather than risk exposure." "Your decision," Morrison repeated, loading the words with implication. "Yes, that's precisely what concerns us. The decision to place yourself in a compromising position. The decision to not die in a flash flood seemed fairly straightforward at the time." Brennan leaned forward, his expression somewhere between genuine concern and something that looked more like satisfaction. "Miss Quinn, no one is suggesting you should have endangered yourself. But surely you understand how this looks. An unmarried woman spending the night alone with an unmarried man." "During a weather event that made travel impossible," Alara interrupted. "Which part of that scenario suggests I had alternatives?" "The part where you were at his ranch in the first place," Morrison said. "This board has received reports that you've been making regular visits to Mr. Turner's property. Unchaperoned visits for weeks now." The room went quiet. Caleb felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his position against the wall, kept his mouth shut, remembered what Alara had asked of him. "I've been visiting Mr. Turner's ranch," Alara said calmly, "on Tuesdays, to share meals and conversation, activities which, last I checked, were not criminal offenses. But highly inappropriate," Morrison insisted. "You're a teacher, Miss Quinn, a woman charged with the moral education of our children. Your behavior reflects on this entire community. My behavior consists of cooking dinner and talking to another human being. If that offends the moral sensibilities of this community, perhaps the community should examine its own priorities." Wright, who'd been silent until now, spoke up in a voice roughened by years of shouting at ranch hands. "You're being flippant about something serious, Miss Quinn. A woman's reputation is fragile. Once damaged, it affects not just her but everyone associated with her. My reputation is mine to manage, Mr. Wright, not yours. Not when you're employed by this board and teaching our children." Morrison's voice had taken on an edge. "We have standards, Miss Quinn, standards that exist for good reason. And those standards do not include teachers engaging in behavior that suggests moral laxity." Alara's expression went cold in a way Caleb had never seen before. Moral laxity. Is that what we're calling basic human connection now? We're calling it what it is. A woman placing herself in situations that compromise her virtue and, by extension, her fitness to teach. "I see." Alara stood, and the movement had the quality of a door closing. "Then let me be clear about something, gentlemen. My virtue is not compromised. My fitness to teach has nothing to do with how I spend my personal time. And if this board believes that a woman having dinner with a man she respects is grounds for termination, then this board is operating from principles I want no part of." "Miss Quinn," Dr. Abernathy started, but Morrison cut him off. "You're not in a position to make demands. This board has the authority to terminate your employment for conduct unbecoming of your position." "Then do it." Alara's voice was steady, almost calm. "Fire me for having the audacity to choose my own company. But don't pretend it's about morality or standards or protecting children. Call it what it is, punishment for not conforming to your narrow view of how women should behave." The silence that followed had weight. Caleb could see Wright and Brennan exchanging glances, Morrison's face reddening, Chen looking down at his hands like he wished he were anywhere else. Then the door opened. The man who entered was everything Caleb instinctively disliked. Polished boots, tailored suit, the kind of grooming that suggested regular access to hot water and mirrors and time to care about such things. He was maybe 40, with the build of someone who'd never done hard labor, and the bearing of someone who'd never been told no. "Gentlemen," the man said, his voice carrying the flat vowels of Eastern education, "I apologize for the interruption, but I believe I have information relevant to these proceedings." Morrison's irritation at being interrupted warred with curiosity. "Mr. Hale? I wasn't aware you were in town. Arrived last night. I had business with Miss Quinn that couldn't wait." Victor Hale, because of course that's who this was, turned to Alara with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Hello, Alara. It's been some time." Alara had gone very still. "Victor, I didn't know you were coming. I sent a letter 3 weeks ago. Perhaps it went astray." He moved further into the room, commanding space with the casual confidence of someone used to being the most important person present. "I won't take much of your time, gentlemen. I simply need to discuss a legal matter with Miss Quinn, one that I believe will resolve your current concerns about her employment." Caleb pushed off from the wall. "And who exactly are you?" Hale's gaze shifted to him, assessment happening in the space of a breath. "Victor Hale, attorney. I represent the estate of Alara's late husband, among other interests. And you are?" "The reason she was at my ranch during the storm." Something flickered in Hale's expression. Recognition, maybe, or calculation. "Ah, Mr. Turner, I presume. How convenient. This concerns you as well." "Victor, what are you doing here?" Alara's voice had an edge Caleb had never heard before. Not fear, exactly, but something adjacent to it. Hale reached into his jacket, produced a folded document with the official-looking seals that meant lawyers and money and complications. "I'm here to inform you that your husband's uncle has passed away, and you, Alara, are the sole beneficiary of his estate." The room went quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet, the kind that came before everything changed. "I don't understand," Alara said slowly. "Harold's uncle never acknowledged our marriage. He cut Harold off when he married me. True, But he had no other heirs, and despite his disapproval, he never changed his will. The estate is considerable. Properties in Philadelphia and New York, investments. Enough money that you would never need to work again. Hale's smile was professional, practiced. Enough money to live very comfortably indeed. Brennan let out a low whistle. Wright sat back in his chair, reassessing. Morrison's expression had shifted from judgment to something more calculating. There must be conditions, Elara said. Men like Harold's uncle don't leave fortunes to people they disapproved of without conditions. Perceptive, as always, Hale unfolded the document, though Caleb suspected he had it memorized. The estate passes to you in full with one stipulation. You must remain unmarried. Should you marry, the entire inheritance reverts to the university Harold's uncle attended. The words landed like stones in still water, ripples spreading outward in silence. Caleb felt something cold and sharp settle in his chest. He looked at Elara, saw her face had gone pale, saw her hands had clenched into fists in her lap. "Let me make sure I understand," she said quietly. "I inherit a fortune on the condition that I never marry again." "That's correct. A monthly stipend would be provided for life, the properties would be yours to manage, the investments would generate income. But the moment you marry, it all disappears." Hale's tone suggested he found nothing unusual about this arrangement. It's not uncommon for estates to include such provisions. The deceased felt strongly about maintaining family wealth within bloodlines. "Even though I was married to his nephew." "Even so." Morrison leaned forward, and Caleb could see the man's mind working through new calculations. "Miss Quinn, surely this changes your circumstances considerably. With such resources, you could leave Crimson Flats, return east, live as a woman of means." "Is that what you'd prefer, Reverend? That I take my moral laxity elsewhere?" "I'm simply suggesting that you now have options. Opportunities that teaching in a frontier schoolhouse cannot provide." Elara stood, moved to the window, looked out at the street where morning light was turning everything harsh and bright. "May I see the documents, Victor?" "Of course." He crossed to her, handed over the papers, stood close enough that Caleb had to fight the urge to put distance between them. She read in silence, her finger tracing lines of legal language that Caleb couldn't see from where he stood. Watched her expression shift from shock to understanding to something harder to name. "This is dated 6 months ago," she said finally. "The uncle died 6 months ago. The estate has been in probate. These things take time. And you're only telling me now. I sent a letter, as I said, and I came as soon as I could arrange to travel." Hale's hand moved to her shoulder, familiar in a way that made Caleb's hands curl into fists. "I know this is a lot to process, Elara, but it's good news. You're free. You can leave this place, start over, live the life you deserve." "Free," she repeated, the word hollow. "As long as I never marry." "Is that such a hardship? You've been widowed for 3 years. You seem to have adapted well to independence." She turned away from the window, and her eyes found Caleb's across the room. In that look, he saw everything, the choice being forced, the cage being offered, the future being written by a dead man's spite. "Gentlemen," Elara said, still looking at Caleb, "I need time to think. This meeting is adjourned." Morrison sputtered, "We haven't reached a decision about your employment." "Then reach one, but do it without me present." She moved toward the door, stopped next to Caleb. "Walk with me?" He nodded, followed her out into morning air that felt too thin, too bright, too full of possibilities that all led to the same impossible place. They walked in silence to the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open prairie, and the only witnesses were grass and wind. Elara stopped at a split-rail fence some optimist had built to mark property lines that didn't mean much this far from anywhere. "Say something," she said finally. "What do you want me to say?" "I don't know." "Then this is insane. That dead men shouldn't get to control living women, that the universe has terrible timing." She gripped the fence rail hard enough that her knuckles went white. "That you don't care about the money." "I don't care about the money." Liar. But there was no heat in it. Everyone cares about money, especially that much money. That's security, Caleb. That's never having to worry about bad harvests or hard winters, or whether you can afford supplies. That's freedom. That's a cage with better bars. Maybe. But it's also real. It's real money, real properties, real opportunity to be something other than a school teacher in a town that's one scandal away from firing her. She turned to face him. If I take this money, I never have to depend on anyone, never have to worry about school boards or moral judgments or whether I can afford to eat. I just have to not marry. And that's the catch, Caleb said quietly. Not marrying might be fine if you're alone, but you're not alone. Are you? She looked at him and her eyes were bright with something that might have been tears or might have been fury. No, I'm not alone, which is why this is such spectacular timing. Caleb leaned against the fence beside her, watched clouds moving across the sky in formations that suggested more weather coming. What do you want, Alara? Not what makes sense, not what's practical. What do you want? I want this choice not to exist. I want to live in a world where women can have both money and autonomy and the freedom to choose who they share their lives with. Her voice cracked slightly. But that's not the world we live in, is it? No, it's not. So I have to choose financial security and independence, or... She trailed off. Or what? She turned to face him fully, and the look in her eyes was raw and honest and terrifying. Or you, or this thing we're building that doesn't have a name yet but feels more real than anything I've had in years. Or the possibility of something that matters more than money. Caleb felt his heart hammering in his chest, felt the weight of what she was saying settle over him like snow. Alara, that's not a fair choice. That money, that's your future, your security. You're just what? A man I have dinner with on Tuesdays? She stepped closer. Don't diminish this, Caleb. Don't pretend we're less than we are just to make it easier for me to walk away. I'm not trying to make it easier. I'm trying to be realistic. That money could change your entire life. So could you. The words hung between them, too big and too true to take back. I won't be the reason you give up financial security, Caleb said. I can't be that person. You don't get to decide what I give up. That's my choice. But her voice was shaking now. Unless you're telling me you don't want this, that I've been reading everything wrong and you'd rather I take the money and go. That's not what I'm saying. Then what are you saying? Caleb looked at her. This woman who'd walked into his house uninvited and rearranged his entire world, who'd challenged him and unsettled him and made him feel things he'd thought were dead, and tried to find words adequate to the moment. I'm saying I want you to choose what's right for you, not what you think I want, not what makes a good story, what's actually right for your life. He reached out, took her hand, felt her fingers cold and trembling in his. But I'm also saying that if you choose me, I'll spend every day trying to make it worth what you gave up. Alara's breath hitched. That's not fair. You can't say things like that and expect me to think clearly. I don't expect you to think clearly. I expect you to think honestly. They stood there at the edge of town, holding hands like teenagers, while the wind picked up and clouds gathered and the world waited for her decision. I need to talk to Victor, Alara said finally. Understand the full terms. See if there are any loopholes or exceptions. All right. And I need you to not make this harder by being noble. If I walk away from that money, I need it to be because I chose to, not because you convinced me I should. Fair enough. She pulled her hand from his, and the loss of contact felt like cold water. Go home, Caleb. Let me handle this next part alone. Alara, please. I need to think. And I can't think clearly when you're standing there looking at me like that. Like what? Like I matter more than money. Like choosing you wouldn't be the stupidest decision I could possibly make. She smiled, but it was broken at the edges. Go home. I'll come find you when I've decided. So he went, riding back to his ranch while the sky darkened and the first drops of new rain started to fall. Went back to his empty house with its tablecloth and its 2 plates, and the ghost of conversations that might have been the last ones they'd ever have. The storm that night was worse than the one before, and Caleb spent it alone, listening to rain hammer his roof and wondering if Alara was safe, if she'd made her decision, if he'd ever see her walk up his track again with a basket and a smile and the kind of certainty that made isolation feel like cowardice. When morning came, gray and cold, he found her standing in his doorway, soaked through and shivering, holding a piece of paper that he recognized as Victor Hale's legal document. I told him no, she said. Caleb's heart stopped. Alara, I told him no. I told the school board they could keep their judgment. I told Victor Hale he could take his conditional fortune and find someone else to cage with it. She stepped inside, dripping water onto his clean floor. And then I came here to tell you that I'm choosing this, I'm choosing you. Not because it's smart or practical or because I've thought it through, but because I'm tired of living my life according to other people's rules. And the only thing that feels right is standing here in your house telling you that I love you, and I don't care what it costs. The words hit him like thunder, like lightning, like weather that couldn't be predicted or controlled. You're giving up a fortune. I'm giving up money I never had for something I do have. That's not a sacrifice, that's just math. She was shaking now, cold and wet and absolutely certain. But I need to know if I'm making this choice alone or if you're making it with me. Caleb crossed the distance between them in 3 steps, pulled her against him, felt her shivering and solid and real. You're not making it alone. I'm right here. Even though I'm probably insane? Especially because of that. She laughed, muffled against his chest, and it sounded like relief and terror and the beginning of something neither of them knew how to navigate. Victor's still in town, she said. He's going to fight this, and the school board is going to fire me, and the whole town is going to talk. This is going to get worse before it gets better. I know. And you're still willing to, Alara. He pulled back enough to look at her face, to make sure she saw him clearly. I've spent years building walls to keep people out. You walked through them like they were made of paper. I'm not letting you walk back out now. She kissed him then, properly this time. Not the quick press from before, but something deeper and more desperate, and full of all the things they hadn't said yet, but would have time to say later. When they pulled apart, she was crying, and he was probably crying too, and the storm was still raging outside, and everything was complicated and messy, and absolutely nothing was solved. But they were together, and in that moment, that was enough. The morning of the wedding arrived with frost on the ground, and a sky so clear it looked like someone had scrubbed it clean of everything except cold blue certainty. Caleb stood in his kitchen, the same kitchen where this entire improbable chain of events had started, and tried to knot his tie with hands that wanted to shake. He'd bought the suit in Billings 2 weeks earlier, the first new clothes he'd owned in 6 years. The fabric felt stiff and foreign against his skin, the collar too tight, the whole enterprise feeling like costume rather than clothing. But Alara had insisted on proper attire, and Caleb had learned over the past months that when Alara insisted on something, it was usually because she'd thought it through 6 different ways and arrived at the only conclusion that made sense. The tie defeated him on the 4th attempt. He gave up, left it hanging loose, and moved to the window. Half the town would be there. Maybe more. Not because they approved, approval had stopped being relevant weeks ago, but because they wanted to witness whatever came next. Scandal or redemption, or something in between that didn't have a name yet. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He opened it to find Sheriff Dunmore standing on his porch, looking uncomfortable in his own good suit. Come to arrest me, Sheriff? Came to make sure you haven't changed your mind. Dunmore stepped inside without invitation, looked around the cabin with the assessing eye of a lawman who'd seen too much to be surprised by anything. Still time to call it off, you know. Victor Hale's staying at the hotel. Could probably smooth things over if you... I'm not calling it off. Didn't think you would, but I had to ask. Dunmore pulled out one of the chairs, sat down heavy, like the conversation required weight. You know what you're doing to her? Caleb felt his jaw tighten. I know what she's choosing. Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, she's about to lose everything she's worked for. That inheritance Victor's holding over her head. It's real money, Turner. The kind that could set her up for life. And she's walking away from it to marry a man who can barely afford to feed his horses through winter. She knows what she's doing. Maybe. Or maybe she's so caught up in whatever this is between you two that she can't see straight anymore. Dunmore leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I've known Alara Quinn for 3 years. She's the smartest woman in this town. Maybe the smartest person, period. But smart people make stupid decisions when they're... He paused, searching for the right word. When they're what? When they're trying to prove something to everyone watching. Caleb moved to the stove, checked the fire he'd built more out of habit than necessity. You think that's what this is? Her proving something? I think she's been playing by other people's rules her whole life, and this is her way of saying she's done. I think you're the mechanism for that rebellion, not necessarily the point of it. Dunmore stood, adjusted his gun belt out of habit. But here's the thing, Turner. Whether you're the mechanism or the point, you're still responsible for what comes next. She loses that money, loses her position, becomes just another woman with no prospects in a town that already judges her for every move she makes. That's on both of you. She made her choice. Did she? Or did you make it for her by being the kind of man who doesn't give her an out? The question hit harder than Caleb wanted to acknowledge. He'd asked himself the same thing in the weeks since Victor Hale had arrived with his documents and his ultimatums. Had asked Alara directly if she was sure, if she understood what she was giving up, if she'd considered the alternatives. Every time she'd looked at him with those creekwater eyes and said the same thing. I'm choosing you. Stop asking me to choose something else. But Dunmore's version of the question carried a different weight. Not whether Alara had made the choice, but whether Caleb had given her room to make a different one. What do you want me to do, Sheriff? Walk away? Tell her I've changed my mind? I want you to be certain, because in about 3 hours, you're both going to be standing in front of half this town, and once that ceremony's done, there's no taking it back. Dunmore moved toward the door, paused with his hand on the frame. Alara Quinn deserves a man who's choosing her because he can't imagine any other choice. If you've got doubts, if there's any part of you that's doing this out of obligation or guilt or because you've gone too far to turn back, now's the time to say so. Caleb met the sheriff's eyes and spoke the only truth that mattered. I'm certain. Dunmore studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Good. Because she's going to need that certainty when Victor makes his play. His play? You think he's just going to stand there and watch? Man like that doesn't travel 300 miles and bring legal documents just to accept defeat quietly. Dunmore settled his hat on his head. He'll try something. Maybe before the ceremony, maybe during. Just be ready. After the sheriff left, Caleb stood alone in his kitchen and let himself feel the full weight of what was coming. Not the ceremony itself, that was just words and witnesses, but everything that came after. The reality of being responsible for another person's life, another person's choices, another person's future. He'd avoided that responsibility for years, built his entire existence around not owing anything to anyone, not being accountable for consequences that extended beyond his property line. Now he was about to bind his life to someone who'd already lost her teaching position, who'd been ostracized by half the women in town, who'd burned every bridge that led back to safety because she'd decided he was worth the fire. The certainty Dunmore had demanded felt suddenly fragile. Not because Caleb didn't want this, he did, with a fierceness that surprised him every time he examined it, but because wanting something and being worthy of it weren't always the same thing. His reflection in the window glass looked back at him, 40 years old, weathered by sun and silence, wearing a suit that didn't quite fit and a tie he couldn't manage. Not the kind of man women sacrificed inheritances for, not the kind of man who deserved the loyalty Alara had shown. But she'd chosen him anyway, and now he had to be worthy of that choice or break trying. He fixed the tie on the 5th attempt, checked his pocket for the ring he'd bought, simple gold band, nothing fancy, but paid for with honest money from his own hand. Then he saddled the gelding and rode toward town, toward whatever judgment or chaos or unexpected grace waited there. The church sat at the edge of Crimson Flats, white-clabbered against the brown prairie, its steeple pointing toward a sky that promised nothing except cold clarity. Wagons and horses crowded the yard, more than Caleb had expected, more than made sense for a wedding that everyone knew was a scandal barely contained by the forms of respectability. He tied the gelding at the rail and walked toward the entrance, aware of eyes tracking his movement. Mrs. Henderson stood with a cluster of women near the steps, their conversation stopping dead when they saw him. One of them, he didn't know her name, made a sound that might have been disapproval or might have been something else. Inside, the church was nearly full. Caleb stopped just past the doorway, taking in the scene with the same careful assessment he'd used approaching enemy positions during the war. Front pew, left side. Mrs. Henderson and her husband, along with the Brennans from the general store. Front pew, right side. The school board members who'd terminated Alara's contract 3 weeks earlier, looking like they'd come to witness a train wreck rather than a wedding. Middle pews. Townspeople whose names Caleb mostly didn't know, who'd probably never spoken to him beyond basic commercial transactions, now gathered to watch him marry a woman they'd spent weeks discussing in whispers. Back pews, the ranchers and drifters and people who lived on the margins of Crimson Flats' carefully constructed propriety, looking more interested than scandalized. And at the very back, standing rather than sitting, his coat still carrying road dust and his expression carrying something that looked like predatory patience. Victor Hale. Caleb had only met the man once, 2 weeks ago, when Hale had shown up at his ranch, with documents and demands, and the kind of polished confidence that came from never having to question his right to get what he wanted. He was maybe 50, well-dressed in a way that made Caleb's new suit look like an amateur's attempt at civilization, with iron gray hair and the build of someone who'd gone soft in comfortable places, but still remembered how to use his size when necessary. Their eyes met across the church, and something passed between them that didn't need words. Hale's slight smile said he thought this whole enterprise was a farce that would collapse under its own weight. Caleb's level stare said he was wrong. Turner, Reverend Morris appeared at Caleb's elbow, looking harried and uncertain. "We should get you positioned. Miss Quinn will be arriving soon, and where is she now?" "Getting ready at the schoolhouse. Mrs. Brennan is helping her with—" He gestured vaguely at his own clothing. "Whatever women do to prepare for these things." Caleb nodded, let the Reverend guide him to the front of the church. The walk down that aisle felt longer than any distance he'd covered on foot, every step observed and judged and catalogued for future discussion. He took his position beside the altar, and the murmuring of the crowd washed over him like distant water. He caught fragments of conversation. "Can't believe she's actually going through with it. That money just sitting there, and she's always knew she was too proud for her own good," but didn't let himself process the words. They didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was whether Alara would walk through that door. 10 minutes passed, then 15. The crowd's murmuring shifted in tone, uncertainty creeping in. Reverend Morris fidgeted with his Bible, shooting Caleb looks that suggested he was wondering if this had all been an elaborate setup for public humiliation. Then the door at the back of the church opened, and Alara stepped through. She wore a dress the color of cream, simple and well-fitted, with her dark hair pinned up in a way that showed the line of her neck and the set of her jaw. No veil, no flowers. Just Alara, walking down that aisle alone because she had no father to give her away and had refused Mrs. Brennan's offer to have her husband do it. Her expression was calm, controlled, giving away nothing to the people watching except the certainty that she'd made her choice and would not be moved from it. But Caleb saw more, saw the slight tension in her shoulders, the careful way she held her head, the determination it took to walk past Victor Hale without flinching, past the school board members who'd dismissed her, past the women who'd been her friends until they weren't anymore. She reached the front of the church and stood beside him, and up close he could see the real cost of this walk. The tightness around her eyes, the way her hands, holding a small bouquet of late-season wildflowers, trembled just slightly. "You came," he said quietly. "Did you think I wouldn't?" "I thought you might reconsider, would have understood if you did." "Then you don't know me as well as I thought." She turned to face the Reverend, and her voice was steady when she said, "We're ready." Reverend Morris opened his Bible, began the familiar words of the ceremony. Caleb had heard these words before at other people's weddings, but they'd always felt like ritual without meaning, sounds you made because tradition demanded it. Now, standing next to Alara with half the town watching and Victor Hale radiating disapproval from the back row, the words carried weight. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." Caleb let the opening wash over him, focused instead on Alara's profile, the way the light from the windows caught in her hair, the set of her mouth that said she was braced for whatever came next. "To join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. If anyone present knows of any lawful impediment, I do." The words cut through the church like a gunshot. Every head turned toward the back where Victor Hale stood, no longer leaning against the wall, but stepping forward into the aisle with the confidence of a man who'd planned this moment. Reverend Morris looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Mr. Hale, this is highly irregular." "So is this entire proceeding?" Victor moved down the aisle with measured steps, his voice carrying easily in the sudden silence. "Reverend, you're about to perform a ceremony that will result in significant legal and financial consequences. I think the parties involved deserve to fully understand what they're agreeing to." "We understand perfectly," Alara said, her voice sharp as cut glass. "Do you?" Victor reached the front of the church, positioned himself where everyone could see him. "Did you explain to your groom exactly what you're giving up? The estate your late husband's family left you, 200 acres of prime Pennsylvania farmland, a house in Philadelphia, and enough invested capital to generate an income that would support you comfortably for the rest of your life." He turned to address the crowd now, performing for the audience. All of it contingent on one condition, that she not remarry. Murmurs rippled through the church. This was news to most of them. The actual scope of what Alara was sacrificing reduced to gossip and speculation until now. The condition, Alara said clearly, was designed to control me, to keep me dependent and grateful and bound to people who never cared about my well-being, only their ability to dictate my choices. The condition was designed to protect you from making exactly this kind of mistake. Victor's tone was patronizing, the voice of someone explaining simple concepts to a stubborn child. You're 32 years old, Alara. You have no family support, no prospects beyond this town, and you're about to marry a man who— he glanced at Caleb with barely concealed disdain— who lives in a one-room cabin and can barely sustain himself, let alone a wife. Caleb felt the anger rise in his chest, hot and immediate, but Alara's hand found his before he could move. Her fingers were cold but steady, and the pressure said, "Let me handle this." "You're right," Alara said, and the admission seemed to surprise Victor. "Caleb lives modestly. He's not wealthy. He won't give me a house in Philadelphia or farmland in Pennsylvania." She paused, let the words settle. "But he gives me something those things never could. He gives me choice. He gives me respect. He gives me a partnership built on honesty instead of obligation." "Partnership?" Victor's laugh was sharp and humorless. "You think this is partnership? This is a transaction, Alara. He gets a woman to cook and clean and warm his bed, and you get poverty dressed up as principal." "That's enough." Caleb's voice cut through the church, quieter than Victor's but carrying more weight. "You've made your objection. Now step back and let us finish this. I'm trying to save her from a mistake that will ruin her life. You're trying to control someone who doesn't want to be controlled anymore." Caleb moved forward half a step, not threatening, but making his position clear. "The money, the estate, all of it. It was never about taking care of her. It was about making sure she stayed under someone else's authority, your authority, now that her husband's family put you in charge of it." Victor's expression hardened. "I have a legal responsibility. You have a legal tool you're using to try to manipulate her into the life you think she should want." Caleb kept his voice level, aware of every eye in the church fixed on them. "But here's what you don't understand. Alara didn't choose this out of desperation or foolishness. She chose it because she's braver than you'll ever be. Brave enough to walk away from security if that security comes with chains. Brave or stupid amounts to the same thing when you're cold and hungry." Victor turned back to Alara, and his voice took on a different quality, softer, almost pleading. "I knew your husband, Alara. He would want you taken care of. He would want you to have the life that money can provide. My husband," Alara said carefully, "never asked me what I wanted. He assumed, like you're assuming, that comfort and security were the only things that mattered. But he was wrong, and you're wrong, because I'd rather have 1 year of living on my own terms than a lifetime of being comfortable in someone else's." The silence that followed felt absolute. Even the Reverend seemed frozen, his Bible still open to the ceremony he'd been prevented from completing. Then Sheriff Dunmore's voice came from somewhere in the middle pews. "Mr. Hale, you've said your piece. Time to sit down and let these people make their own choices." Victor looked around the church, seemed to recognize that whatever play he'd planned wasn't working the way he'd expected. The crowd wasn't rallying to his side. If anything, they looked uncomfortable with his interruption, uncertain about this outsider trying to stop something they'd come to witness. "Fine." Victor straightened his coat with sharp, angry movements. "Make your mistake, Alara. Marry your rancher, live in your cabin, spend your winters wondering if you'll have enough to eat. But don't come looking for help when it all falls apart. That money, that security, once you walk away from it, it's gone. There's no changing your mind, no coming back." "I understand. Do you?" Victor moved closer, lowered his voice so only the three of them could hear clearly. "Because I don't think you do. I think you're so caught up in this fantasy of independence that you can't see reality. This man," he gestured at Caleb, "can't give you anything. No future, no stability, no life worth having. And when you finally realize that, when the romance wears off and you're left with nothing but hard ground and harder choices, remember that you chose this. Not him. You." Alara's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes went cold and distant. "I'll remember. Now get out of the way." Victor held her gaze for another moment, then stepped back. But instead of returning to his seat, he walked to the church door, paused there long enough to be noticed, then left. The door closed behind him with a sound like punctuation. The crowd's murmuring started up again, louder now, waves of speculation and judgment washing over the church. Reverend Morris looked between Caleb and Alara like he was hoping one of them would give him permission to abandon this entire enterprise. "Reverend," Alara said firmly, "please continue." Morris swallowed hard, found his place in the Bible again. "Are you certain?" "Continue." So he did, rushing through the words now like he wanted them finished before anything else could go wrong. The traditional vows, the exchange of rings, the pronouncements that legally bound two people together whether society approved or not. When it came time for Caleb to say "I do," his voice was steady. When Alara said the same, hers was stronger. "I now pronounce you man and wife." Reverend Morris closed his Bible with a snap that sounded too much like relief. "You may kiss the bride." Caleb turned to Alara, saw in her face the cost of everything that had just happened, the public confrontation, the reminder of what she was giving up, the knowledge that there was no going back from this moment. He kissed her gently, aware of the watching crowd, but caring less about them than about the woman in front of him, who'd just set her entire life on fire for the chance to build something new from the ashes. When they separated, Alara's eyes were bright with something that might have been tears, or might have been fierce triumph. "We did it. We did. Now what?" "Now we walk back down that aisle and face whatever comes next." They turned together, still holding hands, and faced the church full of witnesses. The expressions looking back ranged from supportive to scandalized, from curious to openly hostile. Mrs. Henderson was dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. The school board members looked like they'd bitten into something sour. The ranchers and drifters in the back were grinning like they'd just seen the best entertainment Crimson Flats had offered in years. Caleb and Alara walked down the aisle together, and this time the walk felt different. Not a woman alone making a choice, but two people who'd made it together, facing the judgment and uncertainty as a unit instead of individuals. Outside, the afternoon sun was bright and cold. The crowd filtered out behind them, forming uncertain clusters in the churchyard. This was the part where there should have been congratulations, celebration, the polite rituals that followed weddings. Instead, there was awkward silence, punctuated by whispers. Mrs. Henderson broke first, moving forward with her handkerchief still clutched in one hand. "Alara, dear, I hope you know what you're doing." "I do, Mrs. Henderson, but thank you for your concern. If you need anything, we'll be fine." Alara's voice was gracious but firm, the tone of someone drawing a boundary without apology. A few others came forward with stiff congratulations that felt more like condolences. Most kept their distance, watching and whispering and performing the calculations that would determine how they'd treat the new Mr. and Mrs. Turner in the weeks and months to come. Sheriff Dunmore approached, tipped his hat. "Well, that was something." "That's one word for it," Caleb said. "Victor left town already. Saw him heading for the hotel right after he walked out. Probably packing now, be on the eastbound stage tomorrow." Dunmore glanced between them. "He meant what he said about the money. That inheritance is gone." "I know," Alara said. "Just wanted to make sure you understood. Some people hear those threats and think there's still wiggle room. There isn't." "Sheriff, I appreciate your concern, but I knew exactly what I was doing when I walked into that church." Dunmore nodded slowly. "I believe you did. Question is whether you'll still feel that way come February when the money's run out and the wind's coming through the walls." "Then I guess we'll find out in February," Caleb said. "Anything else, Sheriff?" "Just this." Dunmore's expression softened slightly. "You've got more people on your side than you think. Might not look like it right now, but there are folks in this town who respect what you just did. Standing up to Victor Hale, choosing your own path, that takes spine. People remember that kind of thing." After the sheriff moved on, Caleb and Alara stood together in the churchyard while the crowd slowly dispersed. Most headed back to town, but a few of the ranchers came over to shake Caleb's hand and wish them well in the gruff, uncomfortable way of men who weren't good with words, but meant the sentiment. Brennan from the general store approached last, looking uncertain. "Mrs. Turner, or I guess it's still Miss Quinn professionally, but, well, anyway, I wanted you to know the credit we extend to good customers applies to you now, too. If you need supplies and the cash is tight, we can work something out." "Thank you, Mr. Brennan," Alara said. "That's very kind." "Not kind, just practical. Your husband here has been trading with me for 6 years and hasn't missed a payment yet. Figure you've got some of that same reliability. He nodded awkwardly and headed back to town. When the last of the crowd had gone and they stood alone in the churchyard, Elara let out a long breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest. That was worse than I expected. Victor? All of it. The staring, the whispers, the way people looked at us like we were either brave or insane and they couldn't figure out which. She turned to face him fully. But especially Victor. I knew he'd try something, but having him stand up there and lay out exactly what I'm giving up in front of everyone, regrets. No. She said it firmly, without hesitation. But I won't pretend it didn't hurt. Hearing him describe my choices like I'm a fool throwing away her future, seeing the school board members nodding along like they knew all along I'd come to a bad end. She paused, knowing that half of them might be right. Caleb took both her hands in his, feeling the cold in her fingers. Elara, listen to me. I can't give you what Victor was offering. Can't promise you'll never be cold or hungry or wondering if we made the wrong choice. But I can promise you this. You'll never be controlled. You'll never be small. You'll never have to perform being something you're not just to keep the peace. That's a hell of a wedding vow. It's the only one that matters. She smiled then, and it was real, reaching her eyes in a way the polite smiles in the church hadn't. Take me home, Caleb. Home. The word felt strange and right simultaneously. You sure you're ready for that? One-room cabin, no Philadelphia house, no 200 acres of prime Pennsylvania farmland? I'm sure. Though I reserve the right to complain about the accommodations when it's 20 below and the wind's coming through the chinking. Fair enough. They rode back to the ranch together, Elara sitting behind Caleb on the gelding with her arms around his waist and her wedding dress tucked up to keep it from dragging. The afternoon light turned everything golden and temporary, like a moment captured in amber before the world moved on. At the ranch, Caleb helped her down from the horse, and they stood together in front of the cabin that was now their shared home instead of his solitary refuge. It's smaller than I remembered, Elara said. It is small. One room, basic kitchen, bed that's probably too narrow for two people. He looked at her seriously. You can still change your mind. I'll take you back to town. We can get the marriage annulled. You can send word to Victor that you've reconsidered. She kissed him, cutting off the words. When she pulled back, her expression was fierce. Stop giving me outs, Caleb Turner. I'm here because I want to be here. This cabin, this life, you. I chose all of it with my eyes wide open. So stop acting like I'm going to wake up tomorrow and realize I made a terrible mistake. People do that sometimes. Wake up and realize. Then I'll deal with it tomorrow. Today, I'm choosing to be exactly where I am. She picked up her skirts and walked toward the cabin door. Now, are you going to carry me over the threshold like you're supposed to, or are we skipping that tradition too? Caleb followed her, lifted her despite her protests about propriety and his back, and carried her through the door into the cabin that smelled like coffee and wood smoke, and the faint scent of the herbs she'd hung to dry weeks ago. He set her down gently, and she looked around the space with the assessing eye of someone seen it as home rather than weekly destination. We'll need to build on, she said. Maybe next summer. Another room, at least. Somewhere I can have a desk, do some writing. Writing? I'm not teaching anymore, but I can still write. Articles, maybe. Essays about frontier life, education, women's experiences. There are journals back east that publish that kind of thing. She moved to the window, looked out at the plains stretching toward the horizon. I'm not going to disappear into domesticity, Caleb. I need you to understand that. I need purpose beyond keeping house. I know I wouldn't want you any other way. She turned from the window, and in the afternoon light her face showed all the complexities she'd been hiding in the church, the fear and determination and fierce hope all mixed together. What did we just do? Got married, scandalized a town, probably ruined your reputation permanently. And chose each other over every safer option we had. That's what I thought. She moved to the table, ran her hand over the cloth that had been there since her first visit. Victor was right about one thing. The money's gone. Whatever income I had from that inheritance, whatever security it represented, we don't have access to it anymore. I know. Which means we're going to struggle, especially the first year before we figure out how to make this place support two people instead of one. I know that too. But here's what Victor didn't understand. Elara looked at him steadily. I've been rich and controlled, I've been comfortable and miserable. I've had security that came with so many conditions it might as well have been a prison. So if the choice is between that and poverty with freedom, I'll take poverty every time." Caleb crossed the room, took her in his arms properly for the first time since they'd left the church. "We're going to make this work." "How?" "Same way I've made everything else work. Carefully. Stubbornly. One day at a time until the days add up to something that looks like a life." She laughed against his chest. "That's not very romantic." "You want romance or truth? With you, I think they might be the same thing." They stood there as the light failed and the room grew dark, holding each other in the cabin that was now theirs together, and Caleb felt something shift in his chest. Not the erasure of old wounds, those would always be there, but the possibility that new growth could happen alongside them. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of coming winter. Inside, they lit lamps and started their first meal as husband and wife, and if the portions were smaller than Alara was used to and the accommodations rougher than anything Victor's money could have bought, neither of them mentioned it. They were too busy building something that didn't have a name yet, but felt like it might be worth every sacrifice they'd made to get here. The first winter tested everything. Not dramatically, not with some singular crisis that could be pointed to and overcome, but with the slow, grinding persistence of cold that found every gap in the walls and wind that never quite stopped. The cabin that had felt cozy in autumn became a daily negotiation with discomfort by December. Alara learned to bank the fire at night so it would last until morning. Learned which corner of the cabin stayed warmest and which stayed coldest. Learned that Caleb's breathing changed when he was truly asleep versus when he was lying awake worrying about things he wouldn't speak aloud. She also learned that marriage to a man who'd lived alone for 6 years meant navigating silences that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with someone forgetting that thoughts needed to be spoken to be shared. "You're doing it again," she said one morning in late January, watching him stand at the window for the 4th time in an hour. "Doing what?" "Worrying without saying what you're worrying about." Caleb turned from his window, and his face showed the wear of a winter that had been harder than he'd wanted to admit. "The feed's getting low. Got enough for maybe 3 more weeks if I ration it careful, but after that we buy more." "With what money, Alara? We've got $12 left from the cattle sale, and I need to save at least 8 of that for spring seed." She set down the shirt she'd been mending, his second best, now his only best since the first had worn through at the elbows beyond repair. "So we spend $4 on feed and figure out the rest when we get there." "That's not a plan." "No, it's faith that we'll find a way, which is different from a plan but sometimes just as necessary." She stood, moved to where he was standing. "Caleb, we knew this would be hard. We walked into it with our eyes open." "You walked into it. I just let you." The bitterness in his voice was new, and it landed between them like something physical. Alara felt her stomach tighten, but she kept her voice level. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I should have been stronger, should have told you no, sent you back to Pennsylvania, made you take Victor's money and live the life you deserved instead of—" He gestured around the cabin. "This. Don't!" Alara's voice went hard. "Don't you dare take my choices away from me retroactively. I chose this. Not because I was fooled or desperate or too proud to see reason. I chose it because I wanted it. You wanted poverty? You wanted to spend your days patching clothes and rationing food and wondering if we'll make it through to spring. I wanted partnership. I wanted freedom. I wanted a life where I got to decide what mattered instead of having it decided for me." She moved closer, made him look at her. "Yes, it's harder than I expected. Yes, there are days I'm cold and hungry and wondering if we made a mistake. But you know what I don't wonder? I don't wonder if I'm living my own life, and that's worth every hardship that comes with it." Caleb's expression cracked, and she saw the fear underneath the anger. What if it's not enough? What if wanting it to work isn't enough to make it work? Then we'll fail together, and we'll figure out what comes next. She took his hands, felt the calluses and cold. "But we're not failing yet. We're just having a hard winter. There's a difference." He pulled her close, and she felt the tension in his shoulders, the weight he'd been carrying without sharing. "I'm scared," he said quietly. "Not of the cold or the hunger or the struggle. I'm scared I'll wake up one day and you'll realize Victor was right, that I can't give you anything worth having." "Caleb Turner, you are the most stubborn, infuriating man I've ever met, and I chose you anyway. That should tell you something about what I think you're worth." He laughed despite himself, and the sound broke some of the tension in the room. Stubborn and infuriating, that's romantic. It's honest, which is better. They made it through that winter the way people make it through most hard things, one day at a time, with small victories celebrated and larger fears pushed to tomorrow. Brennan extended them credit at the store, as promised. Two of the ranchers who'd grinned at the wedding brought by extra hay in February, claiming they'd over-ordered and needed the space. Sheriff Dunmore hired Caleb for 3 days' work helping transport prisoners to the territorial courthouse, which paid enough to cover the feed shortage. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the town's attitude shifted. Not everyone. The school board members still crossed the street to avoid them. Some of the women who'd been Alara's acquaintances maintained their distance, but others, the ones who'd been paying attention to more than just scandal, started to recognize what was actually happening. A woman who'd chosen principle over security and was making it work. A man who'd been half dead from isolation, coming back to life. A partnership that refused to collapse under the weight of everyone's expectations. Mrs. Henderson was the first to break ranks publicly, showing up at the cabin in early March with a basket of preserves and a carefully neutral expression. "I'm not here to apologize for having opinions," she said from the doorway, "but I'm here to say I might have been hasty in some of my judgments." Alara, who'd been scrubbing the floor, stood slowly. "What changed your mind?" "My husband pointed out that you've been living on a third of what most families need and haven't once asked for charity or complained about your circumstances. Said that kind of spine deserves respect even if he doesn't agree with the choices that required it." She held out the basket. "Also, I made too many preserves last fall, and they'll go bad if someone doesn't use them." "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. Don't thank me yet. I'm still not sure you didn't make a mistake, but I'm willing to admit I might be wrong about how big a mistake it was." It was the closest thing to an apology Alara was likely to get, and she accepted it for what it was, an acknowledgement that she'd survived what everyone thought would destroy her. Spring came late that year, but when it arrived, it brought possibility with it. Caleb planted a garden 3 times the size of what he'd maintained alone, and Alara proved to have a better hand with vegetables than either of them expected. The horses produced a foal that showed promise, and 2 different ranchers expressed interest in buying it once it was old enough to train. And in April, 3 months after Alara's last payment from the inheritance had run out, a letter arrived from an editor in Boston. Caleb found her sitting at the table reading it for the 3rd time, her expression caught between disbelief and triumph. "What is it? Remember those essays I've been writing? About frontier life, women's experiences, the reality of living outside conventional structures?" She held up the letter. "This editor wants to publish them, 3 of them in their summer editions, and he's offering to pay." "How much?" $15 per essay. Caleb did the math quickly. $45 was more than he'd made on the last cattle drive. It was enough to buy feed for the entire next winter and still have money left over. "Alara, that's—" "I know." She stood, paced to the window and back. "I wrote them thinking maybe someone would read them someday, find something useful in the perspective. But I didn't actually think they'd be worth money." "What are they about?" "The first one is about the choice between security and autonomy. The second is about redefining success when you're living outside traditional structures. The third—" She paused, looked at him carefully. "The third is about you, about a woman who met a man who'd chosen isolation over connection, and how watching him learn to open that door changed her understanding of what courage actually means." Caleb felt something shift in his chest. "You wrote about me. I wrote about us. About what it looks like when 2 people decide that building something real is worth more than maintaining something safe." She moved to where he stood. "Is that all right? I didn't use your name, didn't identify the town, but the story is ours. And now strangers in Boston are going to read it. If it bothers you, I'll write to the editor and pull it. The money's good, but it's not worth making you uncomfortable." Caleb thought about the man he'd been 2 years ago. Isolated, convinced that distance was safety, building walls higher every year. Thought about the woman who'd walked through his door with a wooden spoon and enough audacity to change everything. "Publish it," he said. "If our story can help someone else find the courage to choose what they actually want instead of what's expected, that's worth more than privacy." The essays came out in June, July, and August, and they found an audience beyond what either of them expected. Letters started arriving, not many, but enough to matter. Women writing about their own struggles with propriety and expectation. Men writing about isolation and the difficulty of asking for connection. People who'd read Alara's words and recognized something of themselves in the story. One letter came from a young woman in Ohio who'd been offered an inheritance similar to Alara's. Money contingent on living the life her family wanted rather than the one she chose. She wrote, "Your essay gave me the courage to walk away. I don't know yet if I made the right choice, but I know it's my choice. Thank you for showing me that was possible." Alara read that letter aloud to Caleb one evening, and when she finished, her voice was thick with emotion. "We did that. Our story helped someone. Your words helped someone. I just lived my life." No, we lived our life together. That's what made the difference. By the time autumn rolled around again, the ranch had changed. Not dramatically. It was still small, still modest, still the kind of place that would never impress anyone looking for obvious success. But it was fuller now. The garden had produced enough to preserve for winter. The horses were healthy, and the foal was promising enough that Caleb had already received serious offers. And Alara had contracts for 6 more essays, with interest from 2 different publications. They were making it work. Not perfectly, not without struggle, but making it work nonetheless. One afternoon in October, almost 2 years to the day after Alara had first walked uninvited into Caleb's kitchen, they sat together on the porch they'd built that summer, small edition, just big enough for 2 chairs and a view of the plains. "I've been thinking," Alara said. "Dangerous habit," says the man who spent 6 years thinking himself into isolation. But she smiled when she said it. "I want to start a school." Caleb turned to look at her. "The school board fired you, so I'll start my own. Not official, not connected to the town. Just a place where children whose families live too far out to attend regular school can come learn." She gestured toward the plains. "There are at least a dozen families within a day's ride who have children getting no education because the distance is too great. I could teach them." "Where?" "Here. We build another room, bigger than the one we added. Make it a schoolroom during the day, storage or workspace in the evening." "That's expensive." "The essays are paying better than expected, and we could ask for some tuition from families who can afford it, offer it free to those who can't." She looked at him seriously. "But I need to know if you're comfortable with that. It would mean regular visitors, noise, our home becoming semi-public several days a week." Caleb thought about the silence he'd cultivated for so long, the isolation that had felt like safety. Thought about how Alara had walked through it like it was nothing, and how the noise of another person had turned out to be less intrusion and more completion. "Build your school," he said. "I'll help." They built it over the winter, working when the weather allowed and planning when it didn't. Come spring, the new room stood attached to the cabin. Rough timber and simple construction, but solid. Alara sent word to the outlying families, and in April the first students arrived. 6 children, ranging from age 7 to 14, riding in with parents who looked skeptical but desperate enough to try. Alara taught them reading, mathematics, history, and the kind of practical philosophy she'd learned from living life on her own terms. The skeptical parents became converts when their children came home able to read, able to cipher, able to think through problems instead of just accepting what they were told. By the second year, she had 12 students. By the third, she had to turn families away for lack of space. The school board in town heard about it, of course. Heard about the woman they'd fired running a successful school from her ranch, teaching children they'd written off as too remote to educate. Some of them resented it. Some of them grudgingly respected it. None of them could deny it was working. One evening in their 4th spring, Caleb came in from the barn to find Alara at the table with papers spread everywhere and an expression he'd learned to recognize, the one that meant she'd been thinking about something large and was about to make it his problem too. "We need to talk." He poured himself coffee, sat down across from her. "All right. I'm pregnant." The words landed into space between them, and Caleb felt the world reorganize itself around this new information. A child. Their child. The ultimate commitment to a future neither of them had been entirely certain would work. "How long have you known?" 3 weeks. I wanted to be sure before I said anything." She watched his face carefully. "Are you angry?" "Why would I be angry?" "Because we didn't plan this. Because a child means more expense, more responsibility, more ways for everything to go wrong." Caleb reached across the table, took her hand. I'm not angry. I'm terrified, but that's different. Of what? Being a father, being responsible for a person who didn't choose to be born into our particular version of making it work. He squeezed her hand gently. What if I'm not good at it? Then you'll learn. Same way we've learned everything else, by doing it badly at first and getting better over time. She paused. Are you happy about it? Underneath the terror? He thought about it seriously, examining the feeling in his chest. Yes, I'm happy. Scared and uncertain and already worried about 100 different things that might go wrong, but happy. Good. Because I need you to be happy. I need us to be happy about this together, not just resigned to it. Their daughter was born in January during a snowstorm that kept the midwife trapped at the ranch for 3 days. They named her Clara, after Alara's mother, and she arrived small and furious and completely unwilling to accept that the world didn't immediately cater to her demands. She's like you, Caleb said, watching Alara nurse the baby while snow piled up outside. Stubborn and infuriating, determined, knows what she wants and isn't shy about demanding it. Alara looked down at their daughter, and her expression was softer than Caleb had ever seen it. I hope she's braver than I was. I hope she never has to spend years being what everyone else expects before she figures out who she actually is. With you as her mother, I don't think that's going to be a problem. The years that followed were full in ways that couldn't be measured in money or status or conventional success. The ranch grew slowly, another room added when Clara was 2, a proper barn built when she was 4. The school flourished, with students sometimes coming from 50 miles away to attend. Alara's essays continued to publish, and while they never made her wealthy, they provided enough income that combined with Caleb's horse breeding, they lived comfortably. More importantly, they lived freely. Clara grew up watching her mother teach and write, watching her father work with horses and build things with his hands. She learned that success meant living according to your own values rather than someone else's approval. Learned that courage was choosing what mattered even when it cost you. When she was 7, she asked the question that Caleb had been waiting for. Mama, why don't we live in a big house like the Hendersons? Mrs. Henderson says we could if you'd made different choices. Alara, who'd been grading papers, set down her pen and gave Clara her full attention. That's true. I could have made choices that led to a bigger house, fancier clothes, more money, but those choices would have meant giving up things that mattered more. Like what? Like choosing who I married. Like doing work that I find meaningful. Like raising you in a place where we value honesty over appearances. She pulled Clara onto her lap. Mrs. Henderson isn't wrong that we could have more, but she's also not considering what we'd have to sacrifice to get it. Do you wish you'd chosen differently? No, not even on the hardest days, because this life, this small, complicated, imperfect life, is mine. I built it with your father, and now we're building it with you, and that matters more than any big house ever could. Clara thought about this seriously. Papa says you were the bravest person he ever met. Did he? He said it takes more courage to walk toward what you want than to stay where you're safe. And that you walk toward him even when everyone said you shouldn't. Alara looked over at Caleb, who was working on repairing a saddle near the fire and trying to pretend he wasn't listening. Your father talks too much. No, he doesn't. He hardly talks at all. That's why when he says something, I remember it. The years continued their progression. Clara grew tall and stubborn and brilliant, inheriting her mother's intellect and her father's quiet determination. The school expanded again, and Alara hired 2 other teachers to help manage the number of students. Caleb's horses developed a reputation for intelligence and reliability, and buyers started coming from as far as Denver to purchase them. The town's attitude had long since shifted from scandal to grudging respect to something approaching admiration. The woman who'd thrown away an inheritance to marry a rancher had built something more valuable than money. She'd built a life that mattered on her own terms. And the rancher who'd spent 6 years in isolation had found that opening his door hadn't destroyed him. It had saved him. One afternoon, when Clara was 12, Caleb found Alara standing at the window of the schoolroom, watching their daughter help younger students with their reading. What are you thinking about? He asked. Victor Hale, whether he's still alive if he ever thinks about what happened here. Why? Because I want him to know he was wrong, that the choice he thought would ruin my life actually made it worth living. She turned from the window. But more than that, I want him to understand that his version of security was just control dressed up in prettier language, and that some of us would rather risk everything than spend our lives in comfortable chains. You think he'd understand that? Probably not. Men like Victor don't usually reconsider their assumptions about how the world should work. She smiled. But it doesn't matter whether he understands. What matters is that we proved him wrong just by surviving, by thriving, by building something real instead of something approved. Caleb moved to stand beside her, and together they watched Clara teach, watched students learn, watched the small empire they'd built from nothing but stubbornness and faith in each other. "You know what I've learned?" Alara said quietly. "What?" "That the best things in life are usually the ones that scare you most, the ones that require you to walk away from safety and toward uncertainty, the ones that make you choose between what's expected and what's true." She leaned against him. "I was terrified that day I first walked into your cabin. Terrified when I chose you over the inheritance, terrified when Clara was born. But every time I chose the scary thing over the safe thing, my life got bigger and better and more mine." "Any regrets?" "Only one. That I wasted 3 years being the perfect widow before I figured out that perfect was just another cage." She looked up at him. "What about you? Any regrets?" Caleb thought about the man he'd been. Isolated, convinced that silence was safety, building walls to keep out everything that might hurt. Thought about the woman who'd refused to respect those walls, who'd walked through them like they were made of smoke instead of stone. "Just one," he said. "That I didn't let you in sooner. We got here eventually. That's what matters." They stood together watching the life they'd built. And if it wasn't the life anyone had expected for them, not Victor Hale, not the school board, not the town gossips who'd predicted disaster, that only made it more valuable, because this life was theirs. Built on choices that had required courage, sustained by partnership that had required honesty, and filled with the kind of meaning that only comes from living according to your own values instead of someone else's approval. The sun was setting over the plains, painting everything in shades of gold and amber, and Caleb thought about that first evening when Alara had walked back toward town with her lantern swinging, how he'd stood in his doorway watching her go and feeling the foundations of his carefully constructed isolation starting to crack. He'd been right to be afraid. Opening that door had changed everything. But what he hadn't understood then, what took years of living with Alara to fully grasp, was that change wasn't the thing to fear. Stagnation was. Safety was. The slow death of staying exactly where you were because moving forward required risk. The door had opened. The distance had been crossed. The isolation had been broken. And in its place, something better had grown. Imperfect and complicated and real in ways that mattered more than any inheritance or approval or conventional success ever could. That night, after Claire was asleep and the schoolroom was quiet, and the ranch was settled into evening stillness, Caleb and Alara sat together at the table where it had all begun. The same table, though it had been refinished twice and expanded once. The same cloth, though worn now and patched in places. "Do you remember what you said that first night?" Caleb asked. "About picking me." "I remember thinking you were going to shoot me through your window. After that, you said you'd picked me because you wanted to meet the one person in Crimson Flats who seemed as uninterested in performing for an audience as you were tired of being. And I was right. You were exactly what I needed." She reached across the table, took his hand. What we both needed, it turns out. 2 people brave enough to stop performing and start living. Best decision I ever made, letting you in. Best decision I ever made, walking through your door uninvited. They sat in comfortable silence, hands linked across the table, and outside the stars came out one by one until the sky was full of light that had traveled unimaginable distances to reach this small corner of the Montana plains. And in that cabin, expanded now, filled with books and student work and the accumulated evidence of lives well lived, 2 people who'd chosen each other over everything else sat together in the quiet, grateful for the courage it had taken to open the door, set 2 plates, and choose not to face the world alone.